the July 28th, 2021 Town of Qualicum Beach Special Council meeting. Be held virtually, of course. I'd recognize the fact we are holding this meeting in the lands of the Coast Salish people, specifically our friends to the west of QFN. Before we adopt the agenda, there is an amendment. We are removing 1025 Qualicum Road until September 8th. They'll bring it back, as we discussed in camera the other day. But so we're going to remove that. And with that, adoption of the agenda as amended.
So moved.
Thank you. Heather, did you catch all that? There's a lot of hands. You can take your pick. Anyway, all in favor? All in favor? Thank you. Business arising from the minutes. Councillor Skipsey.
Yeah, so I would move my motion with regard to the illumination consultant.
Just as a point of order, though, if I may. So if you look at Robert's Rules of Order for motions that are out of order, on page 112 of the 11th edition, it does state that a motion, I'll just read out the exact text. No main motion is an order that would conflict with or present substantially the same question as one which has been temporarily but not finally disposed of. And so if you go back to our May 27th meeting, as our first meeting as a council of 5, we did have a discussion about protocols regarding how to address the issue with lights, and that motion's been deferred. So procedurally, the correct way to do it is to actually revisit that motion, make that go live now, and then make a decision on the protocol.
So do you to reconsider? That's what you're saying. Councillor Skipsey.
Yeah, so there was a subsequent motion that was adopted by council, and that was with regard to hiring an illumination consultant. And so these motions relate to that motion, not the previous one, in my.
And then in which case we have, sorry if I may, just again, point of order, then we have a live motion which has already been decided. We have to revisit that motion, reconsider that thing, and that was an in-camera decision. So we can't really do that either. So on both points, we might want to talk to the corporate officer to determine what is the proper way forward here.
I'm just going to wait. Robert, I see your hand. I'm just going to wait for Heather to speak. And I'm not really sure where we're going with this one.
Thank you. Yes. The motion, so there's been 5 motions on this matter that are actually confirmed by council. And as Councillor Skipsey alluded to, the July 21st one is the most recent one. And then there's the 4 other motions. One is that at locations where a streetlight modification is requested, council will direct staff to perform a thorough examination of all parameters such as height, divot, arm length, and luminaire orientation. And that the second one is that downgrading or removal of street lighting only be considered after professional evaluation by illumination engineer on the impact to the illumination levels and safety are proposed of the change. And the next one is that staff be directed to report back to council with more articulated, systematic complaint process for evaluating the LED street lights. That includes neighborhood consultation for council review. And the last one is that council directs staff to request proposals from independent qualified illumination engineers to conduct a review of lighting complaints as a result of the installation of the 4000K 75-watt LED lighting as part of the ongoing street lighting program within the town of Qualicum Beach. So I see this notice of motion that Councillor Skipsey has brought forward as new information that she is requesting. She's asking for a committee of the whole meeting, which has not been requested yet. And she is some of the inclusions of the item, which is the location and the wattage, is included in this previous motion, but the other components of the resolution are new information. So I'm not quite sure where Councillor Harrison is going.
So if I may, I think the second part is perfectly valid. The recommendation for a committee of the whole, I think that's great. But I think the first part is actually a reiteration of something that's currently live. So the first part, I think we just might want to not deal with right now. But the second part for the committee of the whole is fine. But if we do want to address protocols, we should actually revisit the May 27th.
Point of order.
Which is still live.
Point of order. Councillor Filmer.
Thank you. I would just like to remind my colleague, Councillor Harrison, that you're talking out of turn. You weren't chosen by our chair to talk. But we're not doing point of orders properly. I just would like to get back on a procedural role here, and then we can carry on with our meeting.
That is, you're absolutely correct at that point. And we're all getting passionate, so I think this is the way to address it. And thank you very much for bringing that up. Councillor Phil.
Thank you. If we're going to start talking about procedural differences and procedural rules, in our last council meeting, we passed a motion that technically was already passed by council, and that relates to our code of conduct. Council passed a motion for staff to bring options forward for code of conduct. And then in the last meeting, we basically essentially passed the same motion, but with different wording and for different options. So if we're going to start talking and really dig into what procedure means to us and what Robert's rules is, and at the beginning of this council, at the beginning of our term, we chose not to really pay attention to Robert's rules. Say, well, yeah, Robert's rules says that, but is it really? And we had a member of council at the time that said on page this, section this, and blah, blah, blah. And now we've got a same council or a different council member doing that. And it's not exactly what we wanted to do. So if we're talking about procedure, let's actually focus on procedure. And everyone needs to play by those same rules.
Councillor Harris.
Yeah, so 2 points. Firstly, the corporate office said she wasn't clear where I was coming from, so I just wanted to provide clarity for that for the purpose of the debate. Secondly, I think you're confusing a deferred motion from a completed motion, and those are two different things. The unique thing here is we have a deferred motion, so the motion is not complete. It is still technically in discussion. So again, the proper protocol, if we're going to discuss this protocol at length, would be to revisit the May 27th decision, make that go live, and then we can have the debate about the protocol based on the staff recommendation, because that is exactly the same thing that we're doing right now.
I look at this, and please tell me if I'm wrong, but the first part of the motion is already active. And the second portion of the motion is to go to committee of the whole. Can we, Councillor Skipsey, just make the motion to go have committee of the whole with all the relevant information? Councillor Skipsey.
Yeah, so actually there are a few differences, as the corporate officer pointed out, or administrator pointed out, that there are some additions to different things. One of the things in Mr. Weir's report, he reported out that it was type 3, although BC Hydro is telling us it's type 2. So that's why I felt that type was very important to include in what is considered. And also there's also a recommendation that it be implemented as a pilot project that was not previously considered by council, I do not believe, or I believe. So I think this is different. And, I think it's important that we look at these cases and move forward on this. I mean, let's not get caught up in the technicality. Let's get moving on the intention of the motion, please.
Heather.
So I can read out the May 27th council resolution, and if council would like to deal with that as to clear the books, because it was a motion on the floor that was postponed definitely, which means it'll be dealt with at a later time. So if you'd like to deal with that now first and then deal with this notice motion, if that would be a compromise to have all of council. So the May 27th resolution says that Councillor Harrison moved, Mayor Weiss seconded that council direct staff to follow the protocol as detailed in the memo of May 27th, 2021 in dealing with resident complaints about the BC Hydro LED replacement program. And then Councillor Westbrook moved and Councillor Harrison seconded that the motion on the floor be postponed definitely. So if you want to bring that now and vote on that and then deal with the notice of motion.
And what is the process for bringing it back at this point?
It just says that, so when you postpone something, definitely it's just to discuss a motion at a later date. So we can do that now if we want to deal with this today.
I think that's the cleanest way to get this done. Unless there's an objection from council, let's bring it back. Let's discuss it and move on.
Yeah, that's just procedure, the right way to do things.
I would move that the motion be brought forward for discussion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Seconded by Councillor Harrison. All in favor? Unanimous. Thank you. So we're back to the May 27th discussion, at which time we could probably amend that to to address what your Councillor Skipsey's concerns are. I'm not so sure that the pilot project is the best thing. I think we should address the ones for sure. I think a pilot project, the wording is just sort of goofy, but my personal opinion. Councillor Skips.
Yeah, well, I think that in the report from the engineer, there was quite a bit of information that may be very different from what I've outlined here. So I think if we want to go back and look at that, I think we should do that at a future date after we have the information from the illumination engineer, and then look at how we want to deal with things. I think what we've learned so far is that a one-size-fits-all approach has not worked for our residents in our community. And there are best practices happening elsewhere, other local governments. For example, the city of Surrey has hired a professional engineer to complete electrical engineering designs, and they have come up with 103 various wattage LED fixture configurations to recommend. And so each installation has its designed light output characteristics. So I'm not sure we want to go in that depth, and obviously Surrey is a much bigger place, but I think it's a good example of how you can tailor the light installations to fit the situations or the locations. And I would also add that the city of Surrey is in the process of arguing to the BC Utilities Commission and other municipalities as well, that the BC Hydro should expect complaints with this rollout, and that BC Hydro should be providing relief from any additional costs for resolving these issues up to a certain grace period. And I think the date they've put out there is March 31st, 2024. So that would give us 3 years to get this right. They're also arguing relief from rate increases because costs are going to go down with the LED technology. And also that additional options such as shielding be provided from BC Hydro. So my understanding is that that decision is currently pending with the BC Utilities Commission. But there's things that are happening that could definitely inform how we go forward from here.
Councillor Harrison.
I would suggest, though, that that conversation is highly hypothetical. We don't know the outcomes of any of those processes at this time. So I think we're better served just sticking to the protocol, which is outlined in the May 27th agenda. And so just to sort of refer back to that. So if you look at, I believe it's page 109 of what we received on May 27th, the protocol outline from the town's engineer goes over the desktop review. And I think to your point about looking at luminaire type and a couple of the other additional pieces of information, we could add that to the number 2 considerations. But at the same time, I think this is something that we're probably going to revisit after receiving the report for the illumination engineer. But it might be best just to get some kind of protocol in place so that the truly problematic lights, which we know there are several truly problematic lights, can be addressed in a timely fashion. And then when we have all the information, including what staff have said of what happens on the ground when they make some changes and what the illumination engineer recommends, then we'll be able to make an informed decision. Right now, we're kind of looking at things through a very hypothetical lens, and it'd be better to have some solid facts to back up our decisions if we're going to come up with some sort of protocol.
Any other comments? Mr. Councillor Westbrook.
Thank you, Mayor Weiss. I think when I first read the notice of motion from Councillor Skipsey, I thought that was a reasonable addition to what we're already doing. And basically it says that we're looking at the complaints that we already have instead of inviting new complaints or more complaints or asking people who have told us about their lights 7 months ago that we have to start over again. So I think the notice of motion, in my opinion, makes the whole process more efficient, and I support that. So I'm not sure why we're getting caught up in different procedures if we just want to make it more efficient for our residents. Thank you.
I'm going to cut this relatively short. I'll come back to you, Councillor Harrison. You know, at the end of the day, we're going to get the same thing done. For me, actually, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. So I can see where the discussion's going. I can see what's going to happen. But I would like to talk to Mr. Weir before we go any further. Bob.
Thank you, Mayor Weiss. The first part of the motion doesn't really present anything new as far as how we've engaged the illumination engineer. I mean, asking him to look at and model various scenarios of pre-existing conditions, current conditions, and any proposed conditions would exactly take into account all of the variables that Councillor Skipsey's tried to list. I mean, so as far as I'm concerned, there's no change in the direction that we've headed with the engaged illumination engineer. So I don't know if that helps to clarify, but I'd say we should proceed with his findings and his computer modelings, and then bring information back to council that can better direct any further actions or decisions, or you know, if we want to implement some changes around town and reassess.
Councillor Harrison.
So just through the chair to our town engineer, what is the current process that we're doing to address problematic lights? Because there are some. Like, what are we doing right now?
So we have engaged the engineer. We are scheduling site visits to take actual lighting level measurements on the ground and collect all of the other physical parameters that we have previously been directed to do by accepted council motion. And then he will take all that information, put it into a computer simulation package, run pre-existing, current, and then various changes and proposals, whether depending on the specific orientation. Like I did present in one of the memos a few locations where it's really quite obvious that we have unusual conditions, and try and remodel them in some fashion, and then bring them back for council consideration. So at this time, we have not proposed to approach BC Hydro for any pilot projects or replacements until we bring information back to council. But I would suggest that even after our first scheduled visit in his first couple of runs, we probably will have something to suggest to council and say, let's change this light here to this color temperature, this wattage, or let's reorient this light and see if we perceive it to be any better. It will also probably come with his observations on conformance to generally accepted good practice for street lighting, and that's something for council to consider as well. And I think comparing us to places like Surrey that probably already have engineered designs for light uniformity and illumination levels, I think is a bit difficult, because there's probably only a couple of corridors in town that really do have illumination levels that meet any kind of engineering standards, and they would be things like the Memorial Corridor after our improvements from, say, Village way down to the 19A, or in the area of the roundabout. Those will be the only places that really will have lighting levels that meet uniformity and illumination standards. So I just think there's so much more information to bring back once we get started with his modeling and data collection for council to consider.
Councillor Harrison, and I'm going to move on.
So if we're basically already doing all this, and we have a motion from the May 27th meeting saying, let's follow the protocol, unless there are any changes to the protocol, which we set out in the May 27th meeting, we should probably just move that. That gets the protocol going, and just add an amendment that will be revisited at a subsequent council meeting when we have information both from staff, the illumination engineer, then we can review the protocol at that time. But it does sound like we're kind of adding an additional motion to repeat something we've already sort of decided.
I don't disagree with it. For engineers saying that we're saying the same thing in Councillor Skipsey's motion, that are going to address all the same issues. Why don't we just move that, and then we can actually come back with, actually do the amendment as Councillor Harrison stated, and then make a separate motion to bring it back to a committee of the whole to address the issue once we get all the information from the illumination engineer. Does that work? Councillor Skipsey.
Well, for me, there were reasons why we didn't deal with the recommendation on May 27th. And so I would want to revisit those reasons. And I think part of that was that there wasn't public consultation, and there wasn't, I think the engineer wasn't directed to bring it back to council. So that, and to the community. So that's my concern, is that if we were to move that there are things in that report from staff that I may not be supportive of.
Well, at this point in time, I'm going to call the question on the May 27th. We brought it back, it's before us. Is there any more comments that need to be made? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? that an up and down, Councillor Filmer, or
Got confused with the question there, sorry.
were you voting in favor or against? No. Thank you. So that motion fails. We bring back Councillor Skipsey's motion. I know where this one's going. Go ahead. Moving it.
Yep. I had moved.
Seconded. Seconder. Councillor Filmer. Further discussion. Councillor Harrison, then I'll call the question.
Sorry, I was muting myself. Thanks. I'm just looking through this here. So I just want to make sure that we get the best of the protocol that's set up by staff and by this. And firstly, I think when we're looking through the protocol, the questions I would have is who's paying for what? So that was laid out in the protocol. That's not laid out in this motion. And then also too, I just think it's a good idea to actually look at the May 27th protocol and look at the elements that were actually there. Because I think this just is reiterating some of the things we've already done. This is essentially duplicating existing motions, but there were aspects in that protocol which provide clarity for staff, which we might want to take a second before we just move this and move on, because it might create actually more uncertainty than certitude.
Councillor Skipsey.
Yeah, well, I think once the findings are reported back to council, that would be the time to look at. So what is the scope of the changes and where we're going from there? And I think that that would be the time to make those decisions.
Further discussion. Councillor Harris.
Just quickly, through the chair to the town engineer. So with all these overlapping motions, does that create any confusion about what the protocol would be and how things would be addressed? Because we have about 4 motions overlapping on the same issue right now.
Well, I mean, I think that the general references to what we're going to look at and where we're going to ask the illumination engineer to model, I think that's fairly clear. The one that is unclear to me is that, and that recommended changes be implemented as pilot projects in these locations. I think that presupposes certain things. I think we just want to bring back information to council, let council make any decisions going forward.
Councillor Harrison.
Yeah, I would actually agree with the town engineer that the pilot project, what is a pilot project? What is the duration of the pilot project? What are the terms of the pilot project for the town, pilot project for BC Hydro? There's so much uncertainty with that. I just move that we strike out everything from the and that in the last portion of the first half of that motion. So that would just end at length of arm, height, and orientation.
So that's your amendment.
Yeah, just as amendment.
Yeah, thank you. Seconder? I'll second. It makes total sense. Absolutely. Discussion. Councillor Skipsey.
Yeah, well, part of the reason for the pilot project was that there are people that have been living with this for 7 months now. And this would be a way to try to fix the problems and see what works and what doesn't work. And so that was the thinking behind the pilot projects. And certainly that would also give examples, you know, people could go and see how that looks. I think it would help inform the way forward.
I think the town engineer just stated that the obvious ones, which we're going to deal with, that there's half a dozen that I know of that are really obvious, that he's going to address those right away anyway. I think that the term pilot project is the problem. Councillor Harris.
Could we just get clarification then from Councillor Skipsey, since this is her motion, as to the duration of the pilot project? When would the pilot project terminate?
Well, I think when the data comes back at the committee of the whole meeting, that would be the time to look at those.
Councillor Harrison.
So for clarity, this would be September or October, so a 2-month pilot project?
Well, it's 1 month if it's September, yes. And by the time it happens and everything's, the engineers had an opportunity to look at it, make the recommendations, implement them, it's probably only going to be 2 or 3 weeks.
Mr. Weir.
The only thing that's difficult about trying to put dates on pilot projects of their beginning and ending is that they also involve the BC Hydro crews to go out and make the changes, which may or may not happen quickly in our our past experience. I mean, we can recommend that we want this light changed to this color temperature, this wattage light. When that happens, is completely out of our control. So, I mean, it's one thing to sort of say that we want to implement changes at obvious locations. Another thing to put dates to it as when we can and can't have it done.
Thank you. I think we're all trying to get to the same,
Mhm.
but we're getting caught up in semantics. I think I would like to just go with the amendment and bring it back to council, and we'll implement fast action as fast as we can, of course, with BC Hydro to address Councillor Skipsey's issues, actually, and mine. I'm totally supportive of making those changes on those obvious ones. I just have a problem with this pilot project thing, as does our engineer. So just speaking to the amendment, Councillor Harris.
So briefly, if this was town lights, I think a pilot project is something we could do. Because it's BC Hydro though, we have levels of interaction here where we don't control a lot of things. So saying it's going to be a pilot project for BC Hydro lights, I'm not sure we can actually do that as a town yet. And we'd probably want to get feedback from BC Hydro saying this is something we're willing to entertain. I'm not sure BC Hydro will create new pilot projects from scratch for a town of 9,000 people. If they're having a hard time dealing with Surrey, which is, I believe, over 400,000 people, is not exactly a great comparable for Qualicum Beach. I do think then having a pilot project here is just words on paper, or it's something that will require a significant amount of back and forth with staff.
Any more comments on the amendment? All those in favor? Opposed? Amendment fails. On the main motion, all those in favor? Unanimous. Thank you. That was somewhat painful for the first thing. Pheasant Glen is gone. Zoning amendment 188 Sunningdale Road.
Good morning, Mayor Weiss. Good morning, Council. This agenda item relates to 188 Sunningdale Road East, which was the subject of a public hearing at the previous council meeting. This memo reiterates a number of the points that were made in the last council meeting, and there are some further clarifications on some of the discussion points at the hearing. So I'll just briefly summarize those. First of all, the question of density. We should clarify that the existing structure is a duplex. So there are two dwellings. There's some discussion about whether there's three. So there are certainly two on the site right now. It's in the village neighborhood, which is identified in our official community plan as where we intend to put density. And if anything else, or if anything, the OCP would encourage more density on the site rather than less. Infill development, which is clearly the direction where we want to go in terms of utilizing existing infrastructure and avoiding the need to extend into natural areas and further sprawl. On the discussion of driveways and parking, this was discussed at a previous council meeting, but staff do not consider Berwick Road to be a higher volume roadway. It is a low volume roadway. In the official community plan, it is identified as a collector road, but that was only as a long-term vision adopted at the time when council thought that Berwick would extend straight across the railway tracks. So since then, the decision has been made that Berwick would be pedestrian only over the railway. Therefore, Berwick only has a short stretch before it dead ends at either end. So it's low volume from the perspective of staff. But in terms of addressing neighborhood concerns over traffic, though, there is an alternative in the memo that council may want to consider. And that is the idea that rather than having three driveways from Berwick Road as proposed by the applicant, one of the driveways could be taken from Sunningdale. So that would reduce the number of driveways on Berwick. It would add one to Sunningdale, but that might be a middle ground in terms of addressing neighborhood concerns over interruptions to the Berwick roadway. And one other point of clarification is that if there's a car parked in front of the garage doors, they would not extend into the roadway or block the roadway. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have to back out into the roadway, which is typical in a residential area, but with approximately 8.5 meters or 28 feet between the driveway interface with the road and the actual garage door, that's plenty of room and it wouldn't block anything. On the issue of water, which was a very key point of interest, both in the public information meeting and the public hearing, I would highlight that the proposed rainwater management plan takes all the roof water and perimeter drains into on-site open bottom cisterns that allow the water to percolate back into the ground. There would be overflow for major storm events, which with the realities of climate change, we always have to consider that. So infiltration of water is able to take 90% of the rain, or 90% of the water on site, but there will always be those conditions where we need to rely on overflows to address storms. Finally, on the issue of trees, there were discussions about trees. The dogwood tree was a big discussion point at the public information meeting, less so at the public hearing, but just wanted to clarify that the developer is proposing to utilize dogwood trees as the street trees in this area. And that's sort of a recognition or tribute to the existing tree on the site. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mayor Weiss. If you have any questions, I'll take them at this time. Thank you.
I can get someone to move the staff recommendation for discussion. Then it doesn't mean we're passing it, but get it on the floor. Councillor Filmer, seconded by Councillor Harrison. Thank you. Discussion. Councillor Westbrook.
Thank you. I'm happy to hear that we're dealing with the rainwater issue. Thank you, Mayor Weiss. I thought that was one of the issues that came up repeatedly. The other one was that the setbacks were, quote, profoundly at odds with what we normally expect. Is there any chance of addressing that through you to staff?
Through the chair to Councillor Westbrook, the changing the setbacks would severely impact what is possible on the lot. If it were a different type of configuration, like an attached triplex, one of those setbacks either on Berwick or Sunnydale would be adjusted, but that's really a completely different type of development than what they're proposing. I think a good parallel to what they're looking at now is the development that the same developer did on Mill. So that's the project that council approved, where there's a duplex and then a single family dwelling on the corner. It has exactly the same, virtually exactly the same setbacks as this. So, if council is concerned about the way it's going to be perceived from the street, I'd recommend that you walk by that development and see it doesn't, from my perspective, it doesn't feel at all incompatible with the neighborhood, and it's quite nice looking. But if council does choose to give it third reading today, regardless of whether you give it third reading today, I would recommend that you walk by and look at the setbacks from that perspective.
Thank you. Councillor Westbrook.
Thank you, Mayor. Just to follow up, this is, I've been to planning seminars and over the years, and one of the things that they recommend a community does not do is spot zoning. That if you're going to do a change in neighborhood, that some kind of zoning, which like this one isn't a rezoning, would be applicable to the entire neighborhood. That would require consultation through a significant process, I would think. And this neighborhood has a lot of character. It's close to the Heritage Forest, the golf course, a lot of history of Qualicum Beach there. So changing this as spot zoning, is that what you would support in a sense to apply to the entire neighborhood to staff?
Through the chair to Councillor Westbrook, that's a very interesting point, and if you'll indulge my musings for just a moment, I'd like to look at the town's overall approach to zoning. And historically, the town has always taken a one-off approach, and so every development does need to go through exactly the same process in terms of zoning amendments and reviews of individual designs every time. That has benefits in that council gets to see every development that comes through and look at its design in detail. But here's the waxing part of what I'd like to say this morning, and in that, I think the process has become a major point of stress, both for neighborhoods, I think also for members of council, and I do wonder whether we're actually achieving the goals that we have set out to do in terms of helping transform our neighborhoods into, progressive places that achieve our sustainability initiatives. So I don't think the current process is working. And the question you ask is a very good one. Spot zoning works in many circumstances. I think for large developments, like if you're looking at a development like Berwick in the downtown, where we had to address big issues like height, I think that's the right process for that. But for something like this, or say this was an attached triplex, is spot zoning the right approach for this? I'm not entirely sure. So if this is something that council would like to further explore, I think we should, because if you think about the approach that the town took with secondary suites, and that was 10 years ago, 12 years ago almost. At that time, there was a concern that neighborhoods would transform overnight, and suddenly we'd have a proliferation of low-cost rentals and all sorts. There was concerns, but actually, it's been very positive. We've had very few concerns about it, and the beauty of that approach is it just allowed one step further than what's allowed. It wasn't allowing a huge step that was disjointed from current zoning amendment or zoning approvals. So it's just one more unit. So maybe we should go ahead and look at neighborhoods and allow one more or two more, right? So in other words, to continue that, to allow these neighborhoods to evolve incrementally over time. So I'll wrap up my musings for the day, but suffice to say that if that's of interest to council, I would very much support a more detailed discussion, both with council and the public.
Just to follow up, Mayor Rees?
Go ahead, Councillor Westbrook.
Thank you. That process about adding secondary suites in the entire community, except for one small area in Eagle Crest, where there was a land use contract. At first, a lot of people were very worried about what it would do to the neighborhood, having tenants and cars and young people, and all those issues came up. But we dealt with them. We had group sessions with I think it was a planner from Oak Bay, who helped us through the process. And we had large meetings at the Civic Center, where we had people from experience of renters that sometimes, people have to be concerned about who you're going to rent to. They're not like having your kids stay in a room and say, turn down the noise. They have rights. Tenants have rights. So they went through a very extensive, and you were part of that, Mr. Sales. So I thought that was exceptional, how we handled that, because in the end, I think it was unanimous support. And I think maybe one or two people were still not sold on it, but you're right. Since we implemented it, it has not been a problem. So that process I would like to see for this. If we're going to rezone a property in a neighborhood like this, that we go through not as extensive as the program for the secondary suites, but at least for a community. And the people who live in the community, they know most about the community, and they are more familiar and passionate about what can happen. Most people expect and realize that there will be some improvements, there will be some changes, there will be higher density, but you bring them along. You don't set people up against another. So this is, in my opinion, the procedure that we should follow, similar to secondary suites for rezoning instead of spot zoning, that we look at the whole neighborhood. Thank you.
Councillor Harrison, Councillor Filmer.
Point out though that that would probably be best be done more in an OCP review than as a separate process. And the process whereby you'd roll that out in a way which is actually fair and reasonable would create significant delays. It'd be a significant amount of time. So with the OCP as it's currently constituted, and the OCP in 2011 as well, the language is actually identical. The boundaries for the village neighborhood is identical. So this has been roughly 10 years. We've had the same definitions for in the OCP, I believe, for the village neighborhood. It is a little sidebar that says the village neighborhood is where we expect increased density. And so with the process we have right now, where we're at, we can talk about a hypothetical process in the future. That's great. But we are sort of currently in the middle of something right now where we have to deal with what's before us. And so if you're looking at essentially an increase from 2 households to 3, I think that's a relatively small increase. I think it's technically the smallest increase you can actually do mathematically. You can't go 2.5 households. That for me makes sense. As far as calling it spot zoning, there's a bunch of different names you can call it, but with the rules we currently have, that's the only way to do infill. They can't increase, I believe, with the current zoning beyond 2. So you have to do something for a spot zoning to allow for 3 households instead of 2 households. There's no other way to do it. You can't have 3 households on a property which is zoned for 2. It just doesn't work. So I think if you want to have a broad debate about spot zoning versus infill versus whatever language you want to use, that's a great debate. It's probably best done through the OCP review process, as opposed to being done on the fly in the middle of one particular project. But I do think we do have to get back to the actual Sunningdale property here and actually look at what's happening. So there's a few things I got from the public hearing, one of which is some person mentioned hardscape and making sure there's no as little asphalt as possible. But I would highlight too, we have almost a quarter of our population is over 75. We have a very large number of seniors who are vulnerable. And I think we have to be really careful that we don't create, if we don't focus on the impacts this has on people with limited mobility, we can create issues with accessibility. So that's just one consideration. As far as one concern I heard from people, just through the chair to staff, one concern I heard, which I think we should maybe follow up on, is parking. So just through the chair to staff, would these proposed 3 homes actually result in parking on the public street?
And through the chair to Councillor Harrison, the proposal is to have 1 parking space inside the garage, and the other would be in front of the garage. The only thing that is a bit unusual about this is that the car parking in front of the garage would end up a little bit onto the road right away, right? Because the distance between the actual garage face and the property line is not enough to park anything other than a smart car. But that was the comment about the distance from the asphalt to the garage face. So functionally, there will be no interference whatsoever with the roadway. It's only an issue if you're looking at the property line. So my response would be that no, I would say it would not result on, it shouldn't result in parking in the street any different than most houses with 2 parking spots.
Okay, thank you. Another comment was made by someone saying the potential selling price of being $800,000 is very high. The median single family freehold home in Parksville, Qualicum last month was $899,000. We are living in a time of ludicrous real estate prices. So 800,000 is actually for a single family home cheaper than the middle of the road home right now, as far as what's being sold. Whether or not that price sounds pretty astronomical to a lot of people, it does, but that is still less than the middle of the road home right now. So for me, all in all, when I look at the fact that this is the smallest increased number of households actually possible on the site, you're going from 2 households to 3 households. I don't think it's unreasonable. I think the debate about how we do zoning is a good debate, but again, that's something that's probably better served through a full OCP review process, where we actually look at all the different neighborhoods, look at how we do density. And for now, I think trying to reinvent the wheel would create a lot of problems in the last year of our term. And it would, yeah, I think that's just really a way to try to find a way to prevent things from happening, rather than looking at, given the rules that we've inherited from previous councils and previous OCPs, what can we actually do that's reasonable?
Councillor Filmer.
Yeah, thank you. I like what's being said. I think for one, I'm not a fan of the whole idea of spot zoning either. I think it's, it does open up a different basket for us. But when the real concerns I had, one was traffic, one was parking. And it does look like staff are working to address those. So it's kind of alleviated some of those concerns. My one comment that I have though is, during the public hearing, we heard a lot, and the emails we've gotten, we heard a lot. Basically any public hearing that we're doing, the one comment that we always hear is not in my backyard. And I really like this. The idea is great. This is great for our town, but not in my backyard. if we let every single person, or if we listen to that comment throughout all of town, we wouldn't build a thing. We wouldn't build a road. We wouldn't build a house. We wouldn't build a grocery store, because the comment is always not in my backyard. So when we look at that, we have to do it somewhere. Here's a piece of property that fits within a piece of zoning. It's large enough. We're able to do it. Are there concerns? Absolutely. But no project is ever perfect. We're always going to hit a project where there's going to be traffic concerns. There's going to be safety concerns. There's going to be environment concerns. There's always going to be something that's not going to fully tick the box. But we also have to talk about and think about what are we trying to do for our community? What are we trying to match for our community? And I have a really hard time sympathizing or listening to the comment of not in my backyard, especially when someone says, I really like it, I just don't want it by me. Because if that's the case, we don't have a town. There needs to be diversity throughout all of town, whether it's single home or duplexes, triplexes. There has to be a diversity of everything. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. So at the end of the day, I will support the project moving forward.
Councillor Westbrook.
Thank you, Mary's. Just briefly on a couple of points that have been raised. Councillor Harrison raised the issue that we shouldn't be doing some kind of consultation process about this. We didn't wait for a public, for OCP review to deal with the secondary suites. It was a one-off issue that we dealt with, because when we deal with an OCP, it's the whole shebang. Dealing with that issue was far more efficient, was focused, and we got it done. And we did the same when we built Qualicum Gardens. We didn't wait for an OCP review. We handled that, which was a big change for Qualicum Beach to have that kind of size of development or building in town. So I disagree with you on that. I agree with Mr. Sales that the process is not working like it could. I also agree with Councillor Filmer, but he said about people saying it's a great project, but not in my backyard. And I've heard that over and over the years. So I kind of sympathize with people who live there and think this is going to really change the neighborhood. I don't think it's a huge change to the neighborhood. I don't like the way we're doing it, but on the other hand, I agree with Councillor Filmer. So at first, when I first looked at all this and I heard all the feedback from our public hearing, I thought I couldn't support this. But listening to the debate, and I think Councillor Filmer, you changed my mind.
Qualicum Beach, I'm not sure who you are with your hand up.
Sorry, this is Luke Sales. I tried to change my name and it didn't let me. I just wanted to clarify my comments that it wasn't my intention to change the process for this development when I discussed, the idea of name zoning for larger areas. I just think it's a discussion that council needs to have. So for this development, we were already well into the process. I'm not suggesting that we change this. I just think at some point we need to tackle the issue of larger zoning issues. And to further to Councillor Westbrook's point, an OCP review, I think, is the best time to discuss changes to the OCP. What the idea of zoning for a neighborhood to bring it closer to compliance with the OCP, that's not an OCP amendment, right? Like we would not be getting anywhere close to the maximum densities permitted in the OCP. So it would just be taking a little bit of a further step towards the OCP. So I'll leave it there for now, but I just wanted to clarify that there was no intention to change the development process for this development. I just want to plant those seeds for discussion.
Understood.
Councillor Skipsey, and then if it's all right with you, I'm going to
Sure.
my comments and call the question. Councillor Skipsey.
Thank you. I will just start commenting about the development on Mill Road. And yes, maybe some people think that the setbacks look fine and it doesn't look out of place. But I do recall when that came before council and the young couple that lived next door were very upset because the setbacks to their property were very small. And so they ended up selling their property and leaving town. So it does greatly impact that. They didn't want to live there looking at that for the rest of their days. Anyways, according to my calculations, we heard from 30 people on this through the public hearing process. 28 were opposed, there was one in favor, and that person wasn't from the neighborhood, and there was one neutral, and that person wasn't from the neighborhood. We heard a lot of concern about traffic, safety, pedestrian, and vehicle. As noted, there are a lot of students that walk in this area. We heard concern about the loss of affordable housing units, rental units. We're going to lose 2 affordable units. And when I walked by that property in the past, I've seen young people sitting out enjoying the garden. And we're also going to lose a piece of our heritage in that I didn't realize it was a Sam Little designed property. We also heard about concerns of the negative impacts on the quality of life for the neighbors and the neighborhood, and perhaps that their property values would be negatively impacted. I'm also not a fan of spot zoning. My very first Federation of Canadian Municipalities conference I attended, I met a mentor from Burnaby. I think at that point he was the president of the UBCM. And I asked him, as a new counselor, do you have any advice for me? And I don't know what I was expecting him to say, but he said, don't spot zone. And the reasons I recall that him telling me that were that it isn't good for the neighborhood. It can pit neighbors against neighbors for the reasons that we've heard. And if the zoning is good for that property, then it's good enough for the neighborhood. So also, it's not necessarily a good planning practice. You end up with a mishmash of setbacks and heights and lot sizes, and it ends up looking, end up looking like there wasn't any plan whatsoever. And also, he said it wasn't good for politicians because it can very easily give the appearance of picking favorites. So I agree that I think we need to review it on a broader scale for neighborhood by neighborhood. And I am going to give my vote to the voices of the neighbors and vote in opposition. Thank you.
Councillor Harrison, and I'm calling the question.
Yeah, sure. So just briefly, the issue though, if we're going to start looking at how we do zoning overall, it does have to be done in a coherent fashion. And I'd caution against, I'm thinking here of how we've done encroachments. If you try to do it little bit by little bit, you can create some real headaches along the way. So the reason why I say OCP review is that we'd probably be looking at how do we do zoning throughout the whole village neighborhood. That's a pretty big conversation. And you want to do that in conjunction with what are the density targets in our OCP. If you wanted to do it for, like eight homes, you can try that. But I just think it's going to create a bunch of headaches on its own. So why are those 8 neighbors all being picked on for the pilot project for how we redo zoning? The other point too is that in terms of uniformity, this isn't Stalinist Russia where you're building giant neighborhoods all at once. This isn't a planned community. It grows organically over time. And so with a small community, you're gonna have smaller developments which happen over time. Things change over time. The price point for homes have radically changed in the last 20 years. There are different concerns in terms of the environment. There's different building codes. So life has changed, life is in flux. So I think it's reasonable to not have everything perfectly uniform on every street. I think that's kind of difficult to adhere to. So, I think for me, this is pretty reasonable what they're doing. It is literally the mathematically minimum increase in number of households. So if we want to have a broader conversation about zoning altogether, that's a separate conversation, which will take a lot more time, I think, than we expect. But for now, I think just for this, it's something that's reasonable.
Thank you. I'll make my comments now before we take the vote. Parking for me wasn't an issue. I think currently that house has 3 or 4 suites in it. So I think the parking is not going to be a concern. Backing up onto the street, which is the other one that was brought up, I would much rather back onto Berwick than West Crescent, First, Mill, all those ones, which are significantly more traffic at a higher speed. So, backing onto Berwick, I don't see it as a big issue. And we try to encourage densification, and then someone does a plan for densification, and then we go to, oh, I don't know if I want to do that, or spot zoning. So I'm just not sure where we should go with that, but I think the OCP review is the answer. Councillor Filmer, I totally agree with your comments. Spot zoning we've been doing on, especially inner city since we started. So I think you don't just pick this project to go, oh, we're not going to do that anymore. I think it is a great conversation to have in the future, as Councillor Harrison stated. And I think at the end of the day, I think Councillor Westbrook said the same thing. Regarding the neighbors, we did the public hearing when I was recording. I don't have all the numbers in front of me, so bear with me. I believe there was 4 neighbors that spoke. The rest were, the people that speak on everything we do and generally negatively. But I counted 4 from the neighborhood that spoke up at the hearing. So I believe it was 4. So I don't think there's a big thing. And I think Councillor Filmer nailed it. Actually, one of the neighbors said, don't do it here, do it down the street. There's a lot for sale down the street. You can do it there. But then we go through the same issue with that. The neighbors that wouldn't want it either. It's just part of a town growing up, and we want densification. We don't want urban sprawl, but we get densification and we look at turning it down. So I think good comments. I think I'll be voting in favor. And at this point, I'll call the question. Ladies and gentlemen, call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Councillor Skipsey. Thank you. I think that covers the meeting. Thanks for making the effort, Councillor Filmer. Good to see you here. Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Councillor Filmer, seconded by Councillor Harrison. All in favor? Unanimous. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you.